The Geforce Experience app. It's interesting. A lot of people have it just to update their drivers, and it gets that job done. Some people have it installed because you can get into, you know, your menus here and do your instant replays, live broadcast, recording, screenshots, all sorts of things. And some people hate this thing and don't even install it on their computer. But what a lot of people don't really mess around with, including me, is if you go here and you go to your games, you can hop into these games, and I mean, you could launch them from here, although I don't really use it for that. But you can also get a optimized, we'll see how optimized it is. That's kind of the point of the video. Graphic settings for the game. So let's just grab a game here, Monster Hunter World, and if we hit details, you'll notice that it gives us my in-game settings, as well as it gives us what it considers to be optimal in-game settings. And you've got this little wrench icon where you can click on that and you can adjust some of the details. For one thing, you can adjust the resolution. For example, in this video, I'm going to target the 16:9 aspect ratio, 2560 by 1440, to be a little more fair when testing this thing, since that's a more common aspect ratio than my ultra-wide monitor. Also, again, it tells you what it thinks is optimal, but you can skew this towards quality, or you can skew it towards performance. Again, if you're far left on performance, it basically puts the graphics on their lowest possible setting. If you're all the way to the right on quality, I believe it does what it considers to be the highest quality setting. But once again, it tells you what it thinks is optimal. And the way I believe it does this is it knows what CPU and GPU you have, and then it gives recommended settings based on both of those factors, as far as I was able to research online. In this video, I want to test this out. To be honest, I don't use this. I play with the graphic settings myself, and I'm actually curious. Does this do a good job? Can it get me reasonable graphic settings? Would this be good for somebody who's just doesn't feel comfortable adjusting their own graphic settings, or could it teach me a thing or two? And to do that, I think we're just going to select a few games that are at least somewhat challenging for my graphics card. I have an RTX 2070 non-super, and then my processor is an i5 9600K. I have 16 gigabytes of RAM at 3000 megahertz, if anyone's curious. Anyway, so I was thinking Monster Hunter and Cyberpunk, and somewhere in here I've got Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I know it's in here somewhere. There it is. So I thought those will be the three that we'll test. So we'll go into those games. We'll look at what do maxed out settings look at. How does my game run on settings that I would use, or maybe maxed out settings. And then we'll look at what Geforce Experience recommends. We'll compare the two, and I'll decide at the end here, and you can decide along with me, if you think that it did a good job. Did it optimize my settings, or did it make did it make everything worse? Would this be a useful feature to anybody? Would you use this in the future? Would I use it in the future? Let's find out. Okay, this is Monster Hunter World. I've got the graphics settings up at maximum. Let's check that here real quick. If I can remember where to find the graphics settings. Options somewhere, right, guys? It's in here somewhere. Yeah, system options. Wait, no, we gotta use the bumper here. Guys, the hardest part of the game is finding the settings menu, I tell you. Anyway, we are on maximum settings here. I just did the highest preset and scroll down here to show it, but just want to confirm to you guys that I just went with the highest preset. We also have downloaded the HD textures pack. Now, we're gonna run around and benchmark this thing. I'm using MSI Afterburner. If you took at the top left-hand corner of the screen, you'll see the GPU usage at the top, and then you'll see the 3 frame rate counters. The one on the left is the current frame rate, the one in the middle is the average frame rate, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. Right, so we're just running around here maxed out so you guys can kind of see a quick benchmark of this and get an idea of what the game looks like. I chose this area just for the sake that it's convenient. It's just the hub location, and it's, you know, fairly demanding. There's a lot of NPCs, a lot of stuff going on here. What I'm curious about is, can the Nvidia optimized settings make our game perform better? What sort of visual trade-off? Will I agree with their settings? Right now we're getting a solid 60 frames per second, which feels great, especially on a game I'd play with a controller. So let's see what GeForce can do for us. Okay, so here we are on the GeForce Experience, and we've gone to this game and we've looked at its optimized settings for 2560 by 1440, which is where we were playing at here. It thinks this is the optimal area. Notice that you can drag this slider to adjust things like I prefer maximum quality regardless of performance. You could also go, I prefer performance, make everything run as fast as it can, but it will tell you what it thinks is optimal. Let's take a look at what it's going to change. It's going to drop our ambient occlusion down to mid, our anisotropic filtering down to high from highest. The anti-aliasing will lose the FXAA and just do the TAAA. The snow quality will drop. I don't think we were in an area with snow when we were looking at the game. And the volume rendering quality for the volumetric fog will drop from highest to low. Let's apply these settings and see what happens. Okay, here we are back in the game. We're using the Nvidia optimized settings. Hey, our frame rate's much better. We're up to around 80 frames per second, up from 60. So 20 frame jump, not that 60 was bad, but one of those settings they changed must have done something, or maybe all of them. But, you know, since 60 was fine before, I'm interested in what kind of visual trade-off we've got here, although I will say the game still looks good without seeing it immediately back to back. Like you guys are in the video, maybe something would be more obvious. But let's see if we can change the settings here and examine more carefully what settings, like, can we see the difference? We can adjust them live in this game, I believe. So ambient occlusion was one of the ones that it dropped. It dropped this to mid from the highest setting. So let's flip through these ambient occlusion settings, see if we can notice a difference. I think I can. So look at the shadows, right? Just look at the different shadows in the different areas here. I know the menu's in the front here, but look around here. Look at these shadows. There is a difference between mid and high. It's not a huge difference, but I am seeing slightly deeper shadows with the high setting. I do prefer high. High does look better. It's not a huge difference. If this cost us 20 frames, I wouldn't want to keep it. But I don't think this one cost us 20 frames. This one doesn't seem to be having a huge impact, at least while we're here in the menu. Let's jump out of the menu and run around and see if this one had a big impact or not. Okay, I'm resetting, excuse me, the frame rate average as we run around here again with this. This does not seem to have had much impact at all. So we are, you know, in the upper 70s now instead of right about 80. So it's a couple frames per second difference. But when our performance is this good, I don't think that's really that big of a deal. So, very interesting. I disagree with the setting change here. Just because it gained us a little bit, it would make sense if you were trying to struggle to get to a good frame rate, but we were already at a good frame rate. Let's look at volumetric fog rendering. Did I say frog? Fog. Anyway, they recommended we go down from highest to low. So let's flip through these. I think it would make sense to look at the water wheel. You can see when it's off where the fog was, right? So with volumetric fog turned off, we can definitely see a huge difference. And let's turn this thing on and play around, see if we can see a difference between the different settings, low, medium, high, highest, wherever we were at. And let's also look at the frame rate difference that we get. Okay. Okay, so we were on the highest settings again originally because I just had max settings on. And man, I really can't see much of a difference between low and any of the other settings. Wow. But there's a huge difference in the frame rate counter if you had been watching that in the top left. So let's run around with highest settings. And let's just double check what this looks like. Let's double check what our frame rate is. And then after a minute here of benchmarking it, we'll go back to looking at it on the low setting. And again, see if we spot any major visual differences and see if that accounts for the big frame rate difference. Because overall, this seems to be the big deal, right? This is the big one. Okay, let's jump back in here and see what happens when we switch this back to low. Again, I don't immediately spot any big major visual difference, but you can tell that our frame rate is so much better. So, you know, I've got to say, for now, this was a good thing that the Geforce Experience spotted. Now, obviously, with a little bit of work, you could go online, you could look up recommended settings for this game, you could play around with the graphic settings yourself, but, you know, it's handy that this was able to spot that one. So overall for this game, I'd say I like that it found this volumetric fog option to turn down. I agree with that setting. I think the ambient occlusion was another one that made a noticeable but small, you know, at least comparatively to this, frame rate difference, but I don't feel like we really would have needed to have turned that one off given the frame rate that we were getting with this change. So I don't completely agree with the graphic settings that this chose, but I don't think they're by any means bad, or that anybody who just clicked optimal settings on this game would be disappointed by the visuals or the performance. I think we should take a look at this in some other games. Okay, here we are in Cyberpunk 2077. Once again, this is without the Nvidia optimized settings. So when I play this game at 2560 by 1440, I feel like an easy to get to setting to use is just to go to Ultra and then stick the DLSS onto Quality, because that'll get me around 60 frames per second for most of the game. If you look at the top left-hand side of the screen, again, you can see the GPU usage to see that we are GPU bottlenecked right now, not CPU. Average frame rate on the left, average frame rate in the middle. The current frame rate is on the left, and the 1% lows on the right. Okay, so as you can see here, we are around 60 frames per second using these settings. These are the settings that I would pick, and again, they were pretty easy to arrive at. And again, there's other areas of the city more demanding and less demanding, but this is a fairly good load and kind of shows where we're at here. I find this pretty playable. Let's see if Nvidia can help us out or if they'll make things worse. All right, so here we are with Nvidia's optimized settings, what they consider optimal for 1440p, again on my RTX 2070. So here's my current settings. That was, again, the Ultra preset with DLSS set to Quality. Let's see what they'd recommend. So they're going to recommend that we drop the distant shadow resolution from high to low. They're going to recommend that we turn off improved facial lighting geometry. And they're going to recommend that we turn volumetric cloud quality down from ultra to off. Honestly, I don't necessarily disagree with that. You're rarely looking up at the clouds. And here's interesting. They're going to recommend the DLSS goes from quality all the way down to balanced. Again, that will lower the internal rendering resolution of the game. So, and then the ray, this is the part that, oh man, we'll start the game up and see how it goes. But in my opinion, kicking on ray traced shadows at the expense of dropping the DLSS even further and kicking down the distant shadows and the lighting geometry, well, let's see how it goes. Let's see how it runs. Let's give it a shot. We're applying these settings, and we are now using optimal settings according to Nvidia. Let's see how it goes. Okay, well, here we are back in Cyberpunk using the Nvidia recommended settings, and just to show you, I'm not fooling you, I'll scroll through here, and if you compare it to what I showed you with Nvidia's recommended, again, they turned that down to low, turned off the volumetric clouds, they turned on the ray traced shadows, none of the other ray tracing features, and kicked the DLSS back down to balanced, and again, we still are at the 2560 by 1440. I'll reset the frame rate counter average. So again, that's up there in the top left corner. I noticed a couple of things. One thing is, I think because it's using ray tracing, that ray tracing calculations, I think, are bottlenecking the rest of the GPU. And you see that the total GPU usage seems lower. I believe that's what's happening. I think it's because the ray tracing is limiting what the rest of the GPU can do. Because like I said, we saw this before with the ray tracing off, and I was seemed to be getting higher GPU utilization, or whatever you'd call that. Okay, notice that our average now is lower than it was before with my settings. Also, personally, I would say that the image looks a little bit worse because the DLSS is down to balanced instead of quality. So you notice a little bit more of the DLSS artifacting. Look at these lines. See how they'll alias a bit as you move. That's a DLSS artifact. Also, there's just a little bit more... Hey, excuse me, sir. He's not being very nice. Anyway, you know, solid line edges is a lot of where you'll see that. Also on certain meshes and things like... Anyway, now that we do get the ray trace shadows. We get these softer shadows cast by sunlight. That's really what we're getting in order to turn down other settings, including the DLSS, and we're actually ending up with a lower frame rate. So just to compare, just to show you guys the shadow thing. So if we turn off the ray traced shadows, notice that what we get here is this is now a harsher pre-rendered shadow with less soft edges. But honestly, I still think that looks pretty good. And I'm going to reset our frame rate counter just using exactly the same settings that Nvidia recommended, okay? That was the only setting that I changed. Look at our frame rate now. Okay, I'll run around a bit, kind of give it the same sort of treatment I gave it before to get our average. But notice our average is up in the high 60s now. Again, that's because the DLSS is unbalanced, and they turned down a couple other things like the volumetric clouds. I don't know, guys. I gotta say, I disagree with NVIDIA here. So, once again, we can average in the high 60s as long as we have the ray traced shadows turned off. Now, again, look at these shadows. These are the ones that we get without ray traced shadows. And, okay, ray traced shadows on. Is that worth the hit to the frame rate? I just reset the average again. Again, I think they are more realistic shadows. It's more real. Softer edges to them, they're less harsh. But it looks like our frame rate average is a good 10 frames per second lower, and we're down in the maybe more, and we're down in the 50s now instead of the 60s. And to me, that is a very noticeable difference to the smoothness of the gameplay. I gotta call it for this one, guys. In my opinion, the optimized settings on this one are a bad choice. Just dropping that much frame rate, and just to get those shadows. Yeah, this just feels a lot smoother with that off. That's all I gotta say about that one. All right, here we are in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Once again, you can see our frame rate counter on the top left there with our current frame rate, average in the middle, and 1% lows on the right. GPU usage seems a little low here. Maybe I'm CPU bottlenecked in this game. I'm not 100% sure. But this is the highest graphic settings. No ray traced shadows turned on. But other than that, I just used the default highest preset just to prove it to you guys. Let's take a quick look. Oops, that's gameplay. Display and graphics. Here we go. So yeah, preset highest. It would say custom if I had altered anything, but you know, there you go. Take a look. And this is pretty close to where I was playing the game when I was playing it. This reminds me I need to actually finish this game. Anyway, so as you can see, I'm running through this town, so you get an idea of our graphics performance. Here, I'll reset the average again since we spent a little time in the menu, so I don't want that to throw it off. As you can see, we're in the mid-50s. Now, I believe this city has been one of the more demanding areas I've been in. Other areas of the game, if I remember right, it's been a little while since I played it. I was getting better frame rates. But anyway, that should give you an idea of what's this game like if we just set everything to the highest preset. Let's hop on out and see if Nvidia can make our experience more optimal. All right, here we are in the Nvidia graphics settings. And again, we got 2560 by 1440p selected. Nvidia believes that this is the optimal place to be. And what are they going to change from the default highest settings that I was currently running at? They're going to change this ambient occlusion to BTAO. The anti-aliasing, I believe this is a more expensive anti-aliasing setting. So I think that's going to be increased. Depth of field. Going down from high to normal. They're changing the level of detail from high to normal. Changing the shadow quality from high to ultra. And they're changing the texture filtering up to 16 from 8. Ooh, and they're going to kick on some ray traced shadows onto medium. Interesting. Let's apply it and let's see how this goes. Okay, here we are. Using the Nvidia optimized settings, I've got to say everything still looks fine. Nothing's really jumping out of me as looks horrible or looks amazingly better. The frame rate seems fairly similar to what we were getting before. We might actually have a slightly higher on average frame rate so far. Let's run through some of these other areas and see what happens. Yeah, I gotta say the frame rate's very similar. We might have had a slightly lower average maybe last time, but it's pretty similar. Interesting. And let's double check the settings actually did apply correctly. Yeah, it did bump that one up. Yeah, it looks like it did apply what they applied. Okay, even running the ray traced shadows at medium. Alright guys, I've got to say that I think on this game, I'm going to call it kind of a wash. I feel like we're getting pretty similar performance. We gained some slightly ray traced shadows with that medium setting, which I gotta say, looking around, I don't see anything looking particularly, at least in this area, like they have just amazingly better shadows or anything like that. I don't know. Yeah, I think in this game I'm gonna say I feel like my performance is similar, or, you know, actually might be slightly higher. Seems fine, I've gotta say. If this was the settings I was playing the game at, it seems fine. So let's try to come to an actual conclusion about this, or maybe some conclusions, which is, you know, would I ever use this myself? Probably not. I'm still probably going to open up a game, try to max it out, and if I'm not getting the performance I need, fiddle with the settings myself, or maybe look up somebody else's recommended settings. That's probably what I'm going to do. Could somebody find some use for this? I could see somebody who's new to gaming on PC, maybe you're moving from a console, looking for kind of that sort of experience, having a button that just hits optimize and gets you reasonable settings to play the game without having to know what any of these things mean is a good thing. But I actually want to delve into that topic a little bit, knowing what these things mean. Playing around in here, you know what I actually found to be the most interesting thing out of all of this is that when you highlight one of the graphics settings, it tells you what it is. And some games do that, but some games don't. So it's nice, what I mean is when you're actually in the game and in the game's menus, a lot of times they don't tell you what the settings are, what they do. And honestly, like, you know, some of these things like ambient occlusion, you might not know what that is if you're not familiar with this, but this is now giving us a little blurb here that explains what that is. And sometimes they try to give you a little picture of what it's talking about. Now, I wish that they would actually give you a picture of each image quality setting that you could scroll through, but as far as I can tell, that does not seem to be available here. So I think that could be an improvement. If they did that, I could actually find this very useful in games where you can't play with settings on the fly. If they gave you a distinct image of what each setting looked like and you could scroll through them at the different settings levels, I think that would be great. I also think it's nice that they do let you target different frame rates, different monitor resolutions. What I wish they did is rather than just having performance and quality, I wish that it gave you actual frame rate targets. So if it could estimate the frame rate that you would get on average for each of these settings, it would be nice if it had a slider between like 30 and 100 or something like that. To me, that would be more useful than just performance and quality, because what I've got to say is whatever it's determining to be optimal didn't seem to be consistent. That was confusing to me. We saw that in Monster Hunter, it tried to target more like 80 frames per second, whereas if you just maxed everything out, you got a consistent 60. Whereas in Cyberpunk, it seemed to be targeting around 60 frames per second, although turning on those ray trace shadows made it drop below 60 a lot. And again, just to get those ray traced shadows. And again, we're sticking with what this game, what this optimizer thought was optimal. And then in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again, that one was kind of a wash. I think my frame rate stayed about the same. I believe I was CPU bound in that game since my GPU usage wasn't very high, at least in that particular area of the game. So that might have been what's going on, but as I believe I said in the video, this Geforce Experience thing is supposed to be reading your entire system, your CPU and your GPU, and designing settings around that. So I don't think that was unfair to throw at it. Anyway, so my overall conclusion here, like I said, is I like that it shows off the images. I think there's room for improvement if it gave frame rate targets rather than just a performance quality slider. And I think this could be useful to people who are newer to PC gaming. And in most of the games, at least gave you a reasonable experience of the ones I tested. Have you guys tested games using this? What was your experience? Because I imagine it could be very different depending on the title. Like, for example, how I really disagreed with the Cyberpunk settings, but the other two seemed fine. Let me know in the comments, and I hope you guys have an excellent day.